And so what I'm going to be telling you about today is an artificial technology interface to the vision system that is being designed to investigate whether we can provide, I won't even say restore, whether we can provide an artificial vision perception to those people who don't have biological vision or have less biological vision. So the idea is that if we can produce phosphenes with individual electrodes, and then we can control those phosphenes, make them brighter, make them dimmer, maybe even change shape, maybe even change color. Okay? If we can control these by controlling the electric currents we put in, that then the brain can figure it out. That's the idea of the vision prosthesis. Wow. Well, thank you, Frank, Dr. Lane. So this is really a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm really impressed and gratified that the seats are virtually filled, even though the weather wasn't so bad this morning, or it wasn't so good this morning. And for me to be able to tell you, as a group of individuals who experience the effects of vision loss and reduced vision every day, and to hear what you have to think about it and see whether what I'm telling you makes sense, it's really wonderful that all the preparations have been made by the Lighthouse, by our university at Illinois Institute of Technology to let this happen. And I must confess, I give lots of talks, I teach classes, so I'm a little nervous here because, you're the crowd here that is ultimately looking and saying whether what we're thinking about, what we're proposing, what the pathway we're going down, whether that makes any sense or not. So you're kind of like, the judges on American Idol here or something, and you got to see my performance. So how many of you have children in here? Yeah, okay, so I see a lot of hands go up. So do sometimes your children say to you, "Oh, Mom, Dad, don't say that, you're embarrassing me," all the time, right? So I'll tell you a little amusing anecdote here, and you'll understand in a moment. Melissa, who is here, is my daughter. And when Melissa was young, and some Saturday afternoon, I took Melissa and her sister Elizabeth, and I said, "Here," because I was working on the vision project at the time. I said, "Here, I want you to put these blindfolds on, and I want you to walk around the house for half an hour." I said, without taking them off. "And I want you to get just some idea and a little bit of experience of what it's like not to have vision." And so they did that, and I don't know if something stuck, but now Melissa is working in the field of rehab psychology for low vision and vision impairment, and she's going to make it her career. So I tell you this because I don't think that by any stretch of the imagination that little experience years ago really gave her the sense of what it's like not to have vision as a sense and a perception. And I don't know either. And when I give talks about the topic, I tell people in the audience, I say, try this. Close your eyes right now and keep them closed for the entirety of my talk that'll last for about an hour. And see how you can do it and see how long it is before you're just aching to open your eyes. I said, and some of that is just that you have a desire to see what's going on. But the other part is biological. It's part of us because our brain is so wired to process vision that when you don't get vision, okay, that there are notable things that happen, and I don't claim to know what those are. You know what those are. And so what I'm going to be telling you about today is an artificial technology interface to the vision system that is being designed to investigate whether we can provide, I won't even say restore, whether we can provide an artificial vision perception to those people who don't have biological vision or have less biological vision. So in order to do that, I'm going to break this up into 3 segments. And the first will be just to talk about vision as a sense and a perception. And many of you here probably know a lot more about this even than I do. But I just want us to make sure that we're talking the same language about vision. And then I'll take some questions. And then I'm going to tell you about a range of vision prosthesis devices that are being worked on, and some of which, in fact, are clinically available. And then I'll take some questions. And then I'm going to tell you about the intracortical vision prosthesis project, or the ICVP, which is our particular approach to a visual prosthesis. I think I see some faces here I've seen before, so you may have heard some of this before. And so if you do, no fair to ask the trick questions, okay? But if you've heard it before, then I hope this will be a good update. If it's new, I look forward to those new perspectives. So let me start out by talking about vision a little bit. And so our senses in general, biologically, are truly remarkable. Nature has given us specialized sensors and organs in our body that are designed to tell us and inform us about the environment that's around us. So when I'm speaking to you now, my lungs are producing pressure of air that comes out through my mouth, that gives the air pressure changes that reach your ears, that are captured by your ears, that are focused and go into your ear canal, that hit this little tiny membrane that we call the eardrum, that moves some little bones, that transfer these sound waves through some fluid channels, and eventually activate some nerves that leave this and go to the brain, and your brain puts it all together, and you understand the content of what I'm saying by the interpretation of these airwaves. And when you think about it in that way, that's really remarkable. Okay, that thoughts that originate in my head get changed into sound waves that travel across the room, go to your ear, get turned into neural little impulses, little electric signals that go to your brain, that then get put together, and your brain creates the perception of my thoughts. Okay? So this almost sounds like science fiction, all right? But it's real. And of course, this is what nature has given us. And so vision, in a very similar way, is a perception. There's no little speaker in your head that's talking to your brain, and there's no little TV tube in your brain that is giving you vision as we think of it. So for the vision sense, light enters your eye. It hits a very eloquent and specialized membranous system called the retina. Very specialized receptors detect color, they detect brightness, and they instantly process this through the retina, which is a very complicated structure. And then these little electric nerve signals come out the optic nerve of your eye. They stop off at a little relay station in the middle of your brain called the thalamus. And then they project up to what's called the primary vision cortex. And if you want to know where the primary vision cortex is, just put your hand on the back of your head, on the 2 sides of your head, just above your neck. You got 2 of them, 1 on each side, and that's the occipital lobe of your brain. And in there is the primary vision cortex, the secondary vision cortex, and I'll talk about some other areas in a moment. And what happens is you've got over 1 million fibers on each side that project to that area of the brain and then fan out 10 times. So you got like 10 million connections going to your vision cortex of your brain. And then the brain starts trying to decode and figure out what all those little nerve impulses mean. And then it starts to decide where things are in space and what color they are. And then it passes that information on to other areas of the brain that then start to figure out, is something moving, is something tipped, is something further away than something else. And it processes all, and then it passes it on to higher centers of the brain, which then figure out, well, what does it mean? Is it happy? Is it dangerous? Do I know this person? Do I not know this person? And then you get the perception in your brain that we call vision. Now that is a really remarkable process. And it is incredibly complicated. Over half of your brain is dedicated to processing vision in one form or another. And that's a lot of neural machinery. That's a lot of equivalent computers that you've got in your brain figuring out the change of the light into these little nerve pulses that go to the brain. And what we're trying to do, and what others are trying to do, is to figure out how to tap into that point. What point to get in on the telephone line so that you can then send the right signals that the brain will say, oh, gee, I think that's kind of like vision. And then the brain will figure it out and put it together. Okay? So that's the basic picture here. Now, the interesting thing about vision as a perception is that really it's your brain that's creating it. So no one of us have the same perception as another. And that's something to think about because, you know, when I look over, I see someone here that has a red shirt. Okay? How do I know it's red? It's red because somebody told me one time. Somebody said, hey, when these kinds of nerve signals go to your brain, that means that's the color red. Okay? So when you're little kids, you got to learn the colors. I remember one time being punished by being told I couldn't get out of my room and out of bed because I said the curtains were pink when they were really green. Okay? I don't know if I was putting my mother on, or if I didn't want to get out of bed, but I remember this story, okay? So you're told, you learn the perceptions. Why do you know something looks like a car? Because somebody told you it was a car, okay? And when you see something you've never seen before, then you're very confused because your brain doesn't have a template. It doesn't have a match. It doesn't know what it is, okay? And so we've got a system here of perception that's unique for each of us. So when I see the red shirt and when someone else sees the red shirt, we agree it's red, but we don't share the same perception. What their brain is doing, what my brain is doing, is actually different. Maybe that's why there are people who are great at art and painting, because they perceive colors and shapes and textures in a different way than most other people do. I don't know. What I do know, though, is that because each person's perception is unique, there is no universal language that we can use to try to talk to the brain if we're trying to create an artificial vision system. Okay. Now, there's many things that can go wrong with the vision system, like any other system in your body. And I'm not a medical doctor, and I can't comment on any one of your particular conditions, and I'm hesitant to even comment on progression of certain disease conditions. I'm an engineer, okay, and I design gadgets, okay, but we have to know enough about the vision system from its anatomy, from its basic functionality, and more importantly, from the perceptions that people have who have vision and who don't have full vision. We need to understand what those perceptions are and how they differ. And there's only one way. You have to tell us. So what we're doing here today is twofold. I'm talking to you and I'm listening to you because I need to know, and we need to know, whether the information about the project that we're putting together makes sense and how that matches with the perceptions that you have and what you think this could do at some point in a person's life that does not have vision. What we're all trying to do is to figure out at what point can we tap into the information line that starts at your photoreceptors and ends up with this high-order perception. At what point can we tap into that? It's like doing a phone tap on a line, okay? And at what point can we stick in artificial information and bypass the part that isn't working? That's kind of what we're all trying to do. And if you think about the vision system sort of as, as a block diagram, you're starting from light going into the retina. It then processes, goes to nerve signals that come out the optic nerve, goes to the relay station in the base of the brain, goes to the vision cortex, and you might think, okay, well, where could we put the phone tap? where could we stick in artificial information in order to try to compensate for the fact that part of the system isn't working the way it used to. Now, how do we put in that artificial information? Well, we do it with little electric currents. So mechanically, it's actually pretty simple. Most vision prostheses and all prosthesis systems, neural prosthesis as they're called, whether they move muscles in your leg, whether they pace your heart, whether they stimulate the cochlea for auditory, or whether they attempt to have vision compensation, they all work by having little pieces of metal that are near your nerves, and they squirt in little electric currents that then go in, and what we try to do is we try to mimic what the normal biological little electric signals were that were there to begin with. And so we try to put in patterns. Now, if you think about this, if I were you, I'd be thinking, wait a minute, this is never going to work. Because this is a little bit like opening up a computer and throwing a bunch of wires in and hoping that you could put the signals in to get Windows to pop up. Okay? And it's a little bit like that, except we have one big advantage. Because our system is so sophisticated and adaptable that we don't have to get the signals to be exactly the way they were. We just have to get them close enough that the tremendous processing power of our brain can say, oh, wow, that's kind of like vision. So let me work on that a little bit. Oh, I can turn it into vision. Okay? And so I can make a perception out of it, and it becomes meaningful to us. Now, that's why experiments that are done on animals, non-humans, in order to determine the feasibility of these, have dramatic limitations. Because you can't ask an animal what they visually perceive. So you set up little tests for them where they can only do something if you can. And I'll tell you, they're smart. If you do it with, I don't want to mention certain animal species here, but you can all figure out in your mind the range we're talking about. And, many of them are smart. And if you set up a little task for them to do, and if they do it right, they get a reward, they figure out how to fool you. Okay, and they don't care about your task. They just care about getting the reward. So it's very difficult to do this in non-humans because the vision perception we're talking about has a meaning to us. So the things that we look and perceive don't have the same meaning to a monkey, even though the basic system is kind of the same. But it doesn't have the same meaning. And so you don't actually have to get the artificial little electric signals you put in to be exactly like the natural biological ones were. Instead, you can get them close enough so you can get the brain to do its magic perception and say, oh yeah, I get it. Okay, now, that's what the doorway looks like now. Okay? It's not quite the way I remembered it, but that's the way it looks like now. So now I know. Now that's my new doorway. Okay? Or, oh, well, that's the face of my husband now. Oh, okay, looks a little different. But guess what? I know that's my husband now. Okay? And so there will be retraining that will take place. Now, what are the different places that we can stick this in? So obviously, you could go to the beginning, which is the retina. Okay? Now, the retina is really remarkable. The retina is a composition of like wet tissue paper, wet toilet paper. Okay, that's what a retina's like. And it is so incredibly complicated. It has many layers. It's actually an extension of your brain. It's really not what we call a peripheral sense organ. Okay? And so as light comes in and it activates these photoreceptors and the neural signals go out, we think, can we stick little electrodes in there? And can we stick electric signals in there that then can get interpreted by the brain as, oh, okay, it's kind of like vision. All right? And there are some moderately successful systems that do this. These are called retinal prostheses. There's one in the U.S. I'm sure you all know about, the Argus II. Okay? And, I remember the early days when the Argus II was in development. There are some in Germany. There are some in Japan. There are some in Australia. There are some at other places in Europe, in France, in the U.S. The Argus 2 is the one that now is clinically deployed in the U.S. And the retina, of course, has two sides. You have the side that's in the eyeball, and you have the side that's behind. Okay? And I'm sure you all know that for some odd reason, nature took the photoreceptors and turned them backwards, so they actually look toward the back of the eye rather than the front of the eye. And, they solve that problem another way for certain animals. They actually have like a little mirror in the back of the eye that sort of focuses the intensity of it so they can see better at night. It's really, frogs, for example, have their vision system that is tuned to small black moving objects. Moving. If you put dead flies in front of a frog, they starve. Okay, because they're looking for things that are moving. Okay, so nature tunes things up. Okay, and what we're trying to do is stick in these electric signals that will take advantage of what's left. So you can go to the different layers in the retina, put electrodes there, activate these signals, and then get the new neural signals to go out the optic nerve. Okay, that's one form of a retinal prosthesis, and you can do that what's called epiretinal in the eyeball. You can go subretinal, that's behind, and there's some that even go outside the eye, in the back of the eye, and try to put in electric currents directly through the eye. And these are all different approaches. Some people feel that there's surgical advantages to one way or the other, okay? And these are moderately successful. People who have these can do a variety of visually guided tasks. There is no restoration of vision as you have known it. Let me make that very clear. Okay, you have millions of connections that reach your vision cortex. At best, right now, we're talking tens to hundreds of electrodes. Okay, so the level of information that we can possibly put in is a lot less than what nature has given to you. But despite that, some individuals who have these do actually remarkably well. It can help as a navigation aid. It can help to do things like look at shapes of objects, shapes of faces, and scanning helps a lot. So you don't just get sort of a static perception, but as you kind of move around, you use your memory to build it up. So if you could imagine looking through a soda straw, and you've got like a little grid at the end of the soda straw, little dots you can see. So if you just held up that soda straw and looked through it, it wouldn't mean much. But if you start moving it around, all of a sudden your brain starts filling it all in. Okay? And the vision system is really pretty remarkable because those of you who are watching me now, okay, your brain's making most of it up, okay? Because it actually doesn't have the speed to process the way I'm moving, the way I'm talking, at the rate that I'm doing it. So it only updates what changes, okay? And the rest of it just kind of all fills in. Okay, that's pretty cool too. So you can use that ability of the brain, and that's what these visual prostheses do. They use the ability of the brain to fill in, to take a small amount of information. And our senses are remarkable in that. You know that, certain kinds of audio communications are very difficult to understand. Like, for example, those that pilots listen to in cockpits. Sounds like a garbled mess, but they understand it because they've trained themselves to understand it. So you can retrain to use these kinds of devices even though they're of very low complexity and resolution compared to what your brain was used to. Okay, now, you could go up the vision system. You could go to the next step, which is the optic nerve. And you could say, could we tap in at the optic nerve? And yes, people have done that. There are some recipients of optic nerve prostheses, in fact, who were in Belgium, and in fact, who Dr. Lane was part of the only team to have gone and actually found out years later how they reacted to these, what their perceptions were. and we've actually published that information. But there were 2 individuals that had electrodes put around the optic nerve. And the signals were put into the optic nerve. And when you put these signals in, it creates the perception of spots of light that we call phosphenes. Now, phosphenes, for some perhaps maybe sighted people who don't know, I bet you all the unsighted people know what I'm talking about. Okay? But if you get up in the morning and rub your eyes and you see these spots before your eyes, that's kind of what phosphenes are like. Okay? Except now they're organized. They're organized in a little pattern. And so the original idea of the artificial vision was like a scoreboard at a ballpark, where you have individual lights, and the lights light up in a certain way, and your brain integrates it all and says, oh, well, that's the shape of somebody's head. Or, oh, look, I can see that's the president, or something like that, even though they're just individual little light bulbs that in themselves don't have any meaning, but the brain can integrate. So the idea is that if we can produce phosphenes with individual electrodes, and then we can control those phosphenes, make them brighter, make them dimmer, maybe even change shape, maybe even change color. Okay? If we can control these by controlling the electric currents we put in, that then the brain can figure it out. That's the idea of the vision prosthesis. So where you stick in, at the retina, at the optic nerve, and later I'm going to tell you about the brain, you get different kinds of phosphenes with different shapes and different capabilities to change them. And so the ones that you get when you're at the retina are probably a little more prescribed than the ones that you get as you move further up the vision system. So the optic nerve system was reasonably successful in terms of understanding how we could use such a system. And I think that, Frank, you remember more than I, but I think the recipients used them for some period of time. And one recipient, I believe, the hardware stopped working. And the other one, the hardware continued to work. And I think that they did continue to use it, am I correct, over a number of years past the implantation that they had. Okay, so the next place we could go to is this little relay station I talked about in the brain that's the thalamus. Okay, and there's a particular part that's called LGN, which stands for lateral geniculate nucleus. So it's a section where you get the projection that go from the optic nerve, go to this point, and that's a little relay station. And frankly, people still argue about why we have it, and some people think it's evolutionary, but it goes there, and then from there, it then fans out and goes to the vision cortex. So you've got like a little mini brain right there. And if you could get electrodes in there, you might be able to use that. And there's some people working on that. There's a particular person, John Pizarris at Harvard, who is working on a thalamus visual prosthesis. Now, it's hard to get there surgically, and it's small. And so it's a difficult problem. But there are many who think that going there, you could stick electrodes in, and maybe you could squirt the currents in there. Now, if you go up to the next step, that's going to be the vision cortex. It's at the back of your head. And you put your 2 hands on the back of your head, that's where we're talking about going. Okay, right above where your neck is. So there you've got the occipital lobes. And I got to tell you, that's a big. Okay, so it's funny, the people who say a retinal prosthesis is better or a cortical prosthesis is better, it depends upon whether they're an eye surgeon or a neurosurgeon. Okay? Because eye surgeons say, hey, we go in, we do surgery on the eye all the time. The neurosurgeons say, I don't want to touch that. You know, the neurosurgeons say, hey, no problem. I can open up your skull. I can put things in. Okay, and it's just a matter of familiarity. Okay, I think that you can make a case for safety to be equal in the hands of an appropriately skilled person. So when we go to the occipital lobe, okay, now there it starts to get complicated because where the vision areas are, the nerve cells in your brain that process the projections that come from the thalamus, the 10 million connections on each side, in the 6 different layers that are in your brain of these neurons that are really small. I'm going to tell you how small they are in a moment. Okay, really tiny, all interconnected, all doing different things, all talking to each other, all sending signals back and forth. Okay, and now mixing their function. So you have what's called the primary vision cortex. And this is called area V1. Really creative, right? V1 for the primary vision cortex. And that's where the entry point into the brain. And that's where the brain starts taking all these nerve signals coming in and starts decoding them and taking them apart and says, okay, this is kind of a luminance thing. This is kind of a brightness thing. This looks like this is a color thing. And so what happens is that each one of these little features get kind of decoded and teased out. Then the brain sends that information to another area that's specialized for that purpose. So you got an area that's specialized for color. You got an area that's specialized for space. Where are things in vision space? You got things that are specialized for motion. You have an area that's specialized for what's the tip, the tilt of something that's there. Is it tilted? Is it moving? Is it further away? Does it have contrast? And now you get these specialized areas that process these special features, and then they send it further up, and then the brain puts it all together. Okay? So the next step would be where it enters the brain. That's primary vision cortex. Okay? And there we got a lot of real estate. It's pretty big, you know. It's about as big as like a child's fist or something like that. You got a pretty much area that you can use, but it's all twisted around. Now, there's a thing called mapping, okay? And if I shine a spot of light on your retina in a certain location, I know exactly where it is in your vision field, because your vision field is defined by the geometry of your retina. Like a little screen, okay? And in fact, that's what glasses do. They focus an image right on the retina so it's clear enough, and, you know, somebody looking in your eye that says, oh, there's a certain spot of light at this point in your retina, they know then where it is in your vision field. You don't have to tell them. Now, when we go to the brain, we don't know, because now the map's kind of all mixed up, and the connections are all going in different places. And so if we stick an electrode in your brain and we say, or on your brain, and we squirt current in, we don't know where you're going to perceive your phosphine is. So we got to ask you, and that's called mapping. So typically the way that's done is that an electrode that's placed on your brain or in your brain is stimulated, and then we say, point to where you think this is in space. So it'd be like pointing to where is the star in the sky, okay? And then you point to where it is, and then we record where you pointed. And then we simulate another one, and we say, okay, where's that one? And you point to that one. And then we get a map of, for each electrode, where is it in your vision space? So vision space just means the field of vision you have in front of you. You have central vision, you have peripheral vision, but if you get a stimulation in your vision system anywhere, it's going to create one of these phosphines somewhere that's perceived as though it's in front of you at a certain space, a certain distance. And we judge distance based on size of things. We judge distance based on how big something is compared to something else. There's all kinds of ways we do it. So this is a rather complicated process of mapping. And this is one reason why there has been an attraction to go to the retina. Because on the retina, you know where you're stimulating, and you don't have to guess. When you go on the optic nerve, you don't know. It's all bundled. Now you got a map. When you go to the brain, you know even less. So you got a map. And that's a rather arduous process, as you could imagine, to go through, because now, just like the person who sees red can't really tell me what's red, I now have to find out, if I squirt current in at a certain location in your brain, where do you perceive it? Where's the star in the sky that you see it? So you got to point to it. And then we got touch screens that when you point, it records where it is. Okay? And that's the process called mapping. Now, going to the brain, though, has some distinct advantages for a vision prosthesis because we've got more sophisticated neural machinery to work with. At the retina, we got dots. Okay? Although there are people trying to get more than the dots. But when you go to the brain, that's where already it's taken everything apart. And so now, sticking currents there, it's much more sophisticated. We got more machinery, but we don't know the language. Okay? And so now we got a new problem. Okay? Not only do we got to know where things are, we got to know how to talk to the brain to do in such a way the brain can figure it out. Now, if I were you guys, I'd be sitting here thinking, all right, this is never going to work. How could he ever make this thing work? Okay? And I'm going to tell you in a moment about our project and how our project thinks we can make it work. But I'd like to pause here and take any questions about vision prostheses in general. All right, so I'm going to go on to the next segment of the talk, which is now about a specific vision prosthesis, which is ours, the intracortical vision prosthesis. So I mentioned before that you can go to the brain to make the interface, this electrical interface we're talking about, and you can put electrodes at the location of the brain in some pattern that then you squirt the currents in, translate it from a camera, and we do the mapping, and we try to figure out then how to use it. So there's two ways to do this at the brain level of the vision cortex. One way is you can put electrodes on the surface of the brain. So these are small discs that are slightly smaller than a pencil eraser, and they're held like in a little sheet, so there's like a little grid of these, and that can be placed on the surface of the brain without penetrating the brain, and then you can squirt little currents through these. Now, neurosurgeons do this all the time. They do it for a different reason. They do it to diagnose certain seizure disorders. So for epilepsy, for example, when somebody has epilepsy that does not respond to drug therapy, they will often go into the hospital and have an operation which opens their skull. Surgeons will then put a sheet that has these little circles of electrodes. These are called Acog Grids, and they will put them on the surface of the brain. They will then close the skull. They'll bring the wires out the back of the head, and they sit in the hospital for 2 weeks hoping they're going to have a seizure. And because if they do, they're recording from all these electrodes, and they're looking to see, okay, where's the spot on the brain that's got the problem, okay? And unfortunately, often, when they sit in the hospital for 2 weeks, they don't have a seizure. And so then they have to take out the electrodes because they got wires coming out the side of their head, and it's a risk of infection, and they don't find out where the seizure is, and they don't know any more than they know before, except the person had an operation. But the reason for me telling you this is that you can use these same type of electrodes on the surface of the brain to not only listen to the brain, but squirt currents in the brain. And people who have had these on the occipital regions, they have had experiments done where there are currents stimulated. And there was one visual prosthesis that I'm sure you've heard about that was implanted by someone named William Dobell, okay, in Portugal, in 16 individuals, that was put on the surface of the brain, and they had the camera connected to these electrodes, and they had varying degrees of experience. And if you want to know more about that particular study, Dr. Lane in the back of the room is probably the world's expert about that study, because he went around the world and talked to almost all the people who had this device put in. Okay, so this was done around the years 2000 to 2002 or something like that. Now, when you do it from the surface of the brain, you're kind of far away from the nerve cells you're trying to talk to. Okay, so imagine an analogy might be if I'm a nerve cell here and I want and you want to talk to me in order to make the vision perception, and I put something in the back of the room that's supposed to talk to me. Okay, and it's as big as the back wall, okay? And now it's trying to talk to me, but it's really talking to a whole bunch. Imagine we're all nerve cells in the brain. So it's sort of talking to all of us at the same time, okay? And it's not really a very effective way to do it. And so dating back really, and there was another experiment on this actually that was done in the late 1960s in the United Kingdom by a very good researcher named Giles Brindley. And they implanted several times electrodes on the surface of the brain. And they did an excellent job of tracking to see what you could get and how you could get it. And the engineer who designed that system was a very good friend of mine. His name was Peter Donaldson. Okay? Now, stemming from those experiences, okay, the National Institutes of Health in the early 70s, remember, this is the late 60s. In the U.S., we could do everything better than the rest of the world. Okay? They said, we can do it better. Okay? And so they decided the way to do this was not to put the electrode on the surface of the brain, but to actually put a little needle electrode that you penetrate into the brain. So you could get the electric currents close to the neurons. So imagine again that we're the neurons, and imagine that I take a telephone pole from the back of the room and I bring it into the center of the room with a little sharpened point, and now I start stimulating all of us through this telephone pole structure that's from the back of the room. Okay? That's what we're talking about. Now, the cortex of the brain is only 2 millimeters thick. Now, I know we're not metric system here, but 2 millimeters is like thin cardboard. Okay? It's very thin. Okay? So when we're talking about needle electrodes, we're not talking about sewing needles. Okay? So the electrodes that you can put in, and that the National Institutes of Health said, let's use these kinds of electrodes so we can get more of them, we can get closer, we can get better resolution of stimulation. Okay? These electrodes are so small that if you took your typical human hair, you could put at least 5 of them across the human hair, and the tips of them are so small that you could put probably 10 to 20 at the tip of your human hair with the tip of the electrodes pointing out. So these are really tiny little pieces of metal. Okay? And to put them in, you could put them in individually. Okay? And they did do that in the beginning. The original project, the National Institutes of Health, had a subject who was implanted, and by hand they implanted little individual, tiny little needle electrodes that are very, very, you're squirming up here just thinking about it, right? Well, actually, if you had one of these put in the tip of your finger, you wouldn't even know. Okay? They're that tiny. Okay? So they put them in tiny, with little wires attached to them, and they tested a human subject with these, and they had about 38 of which they could get readings from about 9 of them. Okay? And it wasn't a great experiment, but they did know that a person after 20 years still got phosphenes. That's what they did know. Okay? So that it was possible to get these phosphenes, and they went around to operating rooms, people who were having surgery to remove part of their visual system, and they tried it there before they had to have the surgery. There aren't too many people that have those operations, by the way. So they had to go around to Canada and everywhere else to find some. But the end result was we figured out, you can still activate the system. And you can do it with these tiny little electrodes. So then the hunt began, how can we make technology in which you could efficiently put in large numbers of these little electrodes, and you could talk to them with the electric currents that we need in order to tap into the vision system at the location of the brain. Okay? Now, the history is long, and my involvement started probably around 83, more intense around 2000. But for almost the last 20 years, I've been working with my team on the technology to make it possible to put these tiny little spear-like electrodes into the brain in a way that's safe, efficient, and allows us to talk to each one of them. So the electrode is called an intracortical electrode, means it goes into the cortex. That's why our system is called the intracortical visual prosthesis. Now, it's not really practical surgically to have to stick in these little individual ones when you want to get a lot of them in there. They did that for 9 or 30 of them, okay? But we're wanting to get in maybe hundreds of them. And so that's not practical. So the idea came up to put them in a little group that we call an array. So the array looks like, if you look under microscope, it looks like a little miniature hairbrush. And it has these little needles sticking up, 16 of them for each of the array. And the array is about the size of a pencil eraser. Okay? So imagine something that's about the size of a pencil eraser, very, very thin, and it looks like a tiny little thumbtack, except it's got 16 little spears coming out of it, of these teeny tiny little electrodes, and that's what gets stuck in the brain. Now, in the back of that thumbtack, we got electronics, and we can talk to it, and it's got an address, and we can call it up, and we can say, hey, module number 23, turn on electrode number 4 and squirt in this current. Okay? And we can do that without wires. We can do it wirelessly, and we can do it with power that comes from the outside of the skin, so there's no battery inside. And these little modules then get put in, and they actually get shot into the brain. Now, you might think, gee, these little things, you sort of gently push them into the brain. Actually, that's wrong, okay? Because you actually damage more when you do that. And the analogy is that in a nail gun, for example, a construction nail gun, it shoots the nail in fast, and that minimizes the damage to the wood and the nail. In a tornado, you can get a soda straw or a blade of grass that gets stuck into a tree, and neither one are damaged. Okay? So we use the same idea. So at 1 meter per second, which is roughly 3 feet per second, this little device is shot into the brain with this little nail gun that we made, and we shoot them in right next to each other, and you get a collection of these little modules, and every one of these modules has its own address. Every electrode in the module has its own address. So it's like a little cell phone network in your head. And then you can call up the electrodes, and then you can start to squirt currents in. Now, when we get that far, my job's kind of done, right? My job was to get the technology to the point where we could and then the people who do the testing have to begin. And that is not only the investigators doing the testing, but the recipients. Because the recipient now is like an astronaut. They're going to a place nobody's been, okay? And they have to tell the researchers, this is what I'm perceiving. This is where it is. Oh, that looks weird. Oh, that's moving. And now you have to go through an extensive testing. This is not about trying to give somebody their vision back. This is about eventually, and we're not recruiting today, I'll make that very clear, but eventually having individuals who, like astronauts, can help us understand the unknown place we're going to, which is how can we talk to the brain? And how can we talk to the vision system of the brain to put in vision information? Now, this is a complicated process. This project started last June officially. Although we worked on it for 20 years, we had to apply to the National Institutes of Health for funding to actually do a clinical trial. So for about 17 or 15 years before that, we were just trying to make the stuff. Could we even make it? Could we make it reliable? And we tested in the laboratory. We torture these things. We stick them in steam chambers to see if we can make them fail. Okay? We put them in non-human animals in order to test their survivability, how well they go in the brain, how well they're tolerated. And then we get to the point where we say, we think we've done everything we can do. The next step is we got to get off the launch pad. Okay? And there's risks associated with that, but are we going to be allowed to do that? So who do we have to ask? We have to ask the FDA. We have to ask the FDA, and we have to ask the institution that will actually implant the devices. So our project is made of 7 institutions, which includes Illinois Institute of Technology, the Chicago Lighthouse, which is a wonderful location now to be able to have the individual, once they have the implants, for all the support services and testing. And it's just being here today is a real pleasure for me. And then we have University of Chicago, where the surgical implantation will be done. That's with the Department of Neurosurgery, Epilepsy, because we have to be careful of seizures that could be induced, and neurology there. Then we have a company in Chicago, which is one, in fact, that I have involvement with, which is called Cygenics. Cygenics makes the electronics that will be used for this. Then there's a company in Maryland called Microprobes. They actually assemble the whole device that will be used to carry the electrodes and shoot in the brain. Then there is, at Johns Hopkins University, a researcher who is expert in doing all the testing that will have to be done. In fact, he's the person who's done a substantial part of the testing for the Argus system. Okay? And then at the University of Texas, we have our colleagues at Dallas. We have our colleagues who are helping us through the regulation process. And I got to tell you, I thought we knew what we were getting in for, but you know what? And good that it's rigorous, okay? Because the FDA, they're not our enemies. They are there, and they are there to ensure that we're doing things that are justifiably safe, that we have a reasonable expectation of benefit, that we've done the right testing, and the testing's pretty extreme, I can tell you, okay? And we're going through that now, and so the project has a timetable that is, in the first 2 years, is what's called the preclinical phase. So in June, we will end the first year of that, and in June of 2019, we will end the second year of the preclinical phase. By that time, we would have to obtain approval from the FDA to do an implantation and approval from the Institutional Review Board at University of Chicago to actually do the surgery. At that point, when we have the approvals, we would then recruit 5 subjects. Those 5 subjects would then get, those volunteers would get implanted over a 3-year period in a varied sequence and group. And we would learn from those subjects the critical questions of whether or not such an interface can be made, can it be useful, can it be safe, and is it something that should be expanded beyond just this initial clinical prototype. So that's where our project is right now, and I want to open it up to questions.